And I turned up 10 minutes late for a half an hour interview. And she harangued me at the front door and said the interview was over and that she had to catch a train. I was like, oh no, I've blown it. So she ran upstairs and she said, okay, I've got a bit of time. Can you make me a cup of tea? And she was shouting this downstairs to me while I was standing outside in the kitchen. And she was a massive figure at the time, a huge figure. Unfortunately, she's passed on now. But she was massive figure at the time. And I was going, bloody hell, I'm in Mowlam's kitchen and she's shouting at me.
Hello and welcome to Freelance Pod. My name's Chandrika Chakrabarti and I'll be your host. Freelance Pod is all about how the internet has revolutionised work. Each week I'll speak to someone working in a creative field and ask them how their industry has moved from an analogue to a digital age or how the internet has invented their job. If you like what we're talking about in the podcast, please do get involved on social. You can find Freelance Pod on Instagram as @freelancepod, on Twitter as @freelance_pod_. There's a Facebook group called Freelance Pod, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. The URL is in the show notes. Don't forget that the success of this podcast relies on you, the listeners. If you do enjoy it, please do rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes. This means that other listeners will find out that this podcast exists and they'll come and join us too. Burnout. I feel like we hear that word more and more often these days, probably because we're all suffering from it. The first online piece to go really viral in 2019 was about burnout and millennials. That was written by Anne Helen Peterson of BuzzFeed, and I'll put a link to her piece in the show notes. Today's guest on the podcast, John Crowley, has investigated and written about burnout and journalism. John is a digital journalist and consultant, and he's been working with the European Journalism Centre on their News Impact Network. Last autumn, John sent out a survey asking journalists to talk about how information worked in digital newsrooms. The results are grim, if not completely surprising. Just over 50% of the journalists surveyed said that they were overwhelmed by the information coming their way during a working day, and they would like to find solutions to help them manage. So John will talk about some of the possible solutions, and he also walks us through his career, which has spanned 2 decades and started in print, in an analogue newsroom where only one computer had the internet. So let's see what John has to say.
So I've been a journalist for 20 years, having started out in what you might want to call an analogue or print newsroom and done the journey over to digital, although I still do work in print. Back then, The Guardian had a massive media section, a pullout in G2 that you and your listeners, older listeners, shall we say, might remember. And I just used to go through that every week. I think it came out on a Monday, and I just used to go through that every week, just trying to kind of find a job. And actually, it's interesting to compare it with now, where perhaps not in the field of journalism, but you speak to young people going and doing degrees, and they already got their startup in their head about what they're going to do and how they're going to launch it and how it's going to be a massive success. And certainly when I was at university, I just had this vague idea that I wanted to read Shakespeare and Chaucer, and I certainly didn't have a career spanned out in my head, and that's a lot different now, 25 years later. So what I just did, I just applied and applied and applied. And I have an Irish background. I was born in London, but I was born to Irish parents. And there's a newspaper still in existence, still going strong, called the Irish Post newspaper, which I applied to as an editorial assistant. So this is on a newspaper. And if at the time, I think just after I joined, one person in the office got access to this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web, but none of the rest of the newsroom had any access to the web. So if we wanted to go into the web, we had to wait for this guy who was the deputy editor to go out to lunch. And he'd really complain because we'd, go and mess up his desk and eat his desk and kind of log onto the internet to do things. So it was very much print based. I was an editorial assistant. So that involved making lots of cups of tea, going to, and remember this was an Irish newspaper, going to kind of Irish dancing events, covering Irish sports, kind of writing up community listings. It was a paper for the Irish community in Britain. So you could be doing kind of what you might call the junior stuff like that. But also, in the first couple of years, I interviewed Jerry Adams, who was, then in trying to strike a peace deal with the British government. So it was a really good introduction to journalism, where you learnt the nuts and bolts, but you also got to interview, these big Irish names that were coming over to Britain, either politics, the arts. Basically, did every job in the newsroom, because I ended up being there 5 years. So everything from being editorial assistant to reporter to a news editor to the arts editor to travel editor. So I tried everything out, and it was absolutely fantastic grounding. But I wanted to go into Fleet Street. I wanted to test myself and kind of work on a national newspaper. So it wasn't so much I came with my knapsack, because I was living in London, but I just basically freelanced around anywhere that would take me, to be honest. And again, I kind of sent my CV out and bothered news editors, and pretty much by and large that involved doing weekend and night shifts, because of course nobody wanted to do those. So I worked at the Sunday Times, the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Telegraph, the Guardian. This is in various reporting and sub-in guises. And for some reason, the Daily Telegraph asked me back a little bit more than the others. And I ended up being, first of all, a night news reporter, then a reporter, then a night news editor on the news desk, which was, quite exciting and nerve-wracking, in the sense that you would have to make calls on stories at night when the bosses weren't there. And, if it was massive, you could bring them up. But very often you had to, really make calls yourself. And then I went on to the day news desk. Then I went on to the Daily Mail on its news desk for 3 years. And from there, I went to the Wall Street Journal, where I worked as a senior news editor. And then I kind of joined the journal. The Wall Street Journal then had a European edition newspaper, and I worked on that. But I found myself gravitating at this time. This is around 2010, over to online, and the journal, which is still, but even then had really big resources in covering the tech story out of Silicon Valley. I covered the digital side of things. I ended up becoming editor of WSJ.com for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. I then became its digital editor over the same reason, kind of running the output of 450 journalists. And from there, I went to Newsweek and the International Business Times, where I was editor-in-chief up until November 2017. And since then, I've been working as a freelance and a consultant. So I was a cub reporter, and this was around 2000. I interviewed Mowlam, who was the Northern Ireland secretary, who helped strike with, or Tony Blair, or some would say, was the lead actor on the part of the government in terms of striking the deal. And I remember I had she was publishing a biography called Momentum, and I remember I kind of got lost on the way to her house. She lived in Hackney, and I turned up 10 minutes late for a half an hour interview, and she harangued me at the front door and said the interview was over and that she had to catch a train. I was like, oh no, I've blown it. So she ran upstairs and she said, okay, I've got a bit of time. Can you make me a cup of tea? And she was shouting this downstairs to me while I was standing outside in the kitchen. And she was a massive figure at the time, a huge figure. Unfortunately, she's passed on now. But she was massive figure at the time. And I was going, bloody hell, I'm in Mo Mullen's kitchen and she's shouting at me to make a cup of tea. And I think looking back, she was on a complete wind-up, and she was basically having fun with me and just winding me up. But I did make her a cup of tea. I interviewed her in the cab on the way to the train station. And at the train station, it was at King's Cross. She said, would you mind carrying my bags? So I ended up carrying her bags across King's Cross station. And I was basically her bag carrier, which she absolutely loved and I'm sure took a huge delight out of. And of course, there's all these people who are, craning the necks going, oh my God, there's Mo Mowlam walking there along with her bag carriers carrying her bags. Got a great interview out of her. Only 20 minutes, did it in the cab. So yes, there's the so-called sexy end of journalism, where you're kind of interviewing these huge big figures of great stature, and then there's the legwork. Apart from carrying bags, obviously for Mowlam, but actually that was quite fun. But there is, joking apart, there is legwork in the newsroom that needs to be done, and this is computational, reading the wires. And for those of your listeners who don't know what computation is, essentially in a newsroom, in a national newsroom, you will have news agencies filing stories from all around, not just Britain actually, but around the world, into one central repository. And it befalls one person. You and me obviously have done this, where you have to kind of literally read every single story that comes in, and you make a pretty quick judgment call on whether to flag that up to the news desk. You might select it and put it in another queue. But this is actually, it's probably getting on for thousands of stories each day, which you've got to read, which are coming in not every minute, every second. So your eye, I feel that, I don't know if you've ever felt this, but I felt sometimes like my eyes were turning to jelly when you were just looking at this so much. And there was a lot of pressure because it was kind of a junior job in the newsroom, but it was incredibly important because you were the eyes on all the stories that were happening out there in the world apart from your newsroom. So your journalists would get assigned the stories that you get picked. So you particularly at the Daily Mail, where if you missed a story that were on the wires the next day, there would be an inquiry into this, an inquest, so to speak, where you would be forced to justify why you'd missed the story, and just saying, well, there was loads of stories and I missed it, wouldn't cut the mustard. And yeah, if it was a big story, you'd lose a little finger for doing it. So you were under pressure. So for those of the people that cared about it, you would not want to miss a story. But obviously, if you selected every single story that was there, you wouldn't be popular with your news desk colleagues. So it was kind of like a point of pride, being able to select the fewest possible stories, but make sure all of them were interesting. But, sometimes you'd make a call, and sometimes, it would be the wrong call, or for various reasons, you'd think that wasn't a story for your readership. But another newspaper would pick it up, and, people turn around and go, that was a page 5 story in the Daily Mirror or the Daily Telegraph. Why didn't you pick that story up? So it was like taking an exam each day. So you're under pressure to do it. But also there was just an overwhelming number of stories just hitting you from everywhere. When I was doing it, you would be one person who'd just be looking at stories from the UK, would mostly come through the Press Association. There'd be a PA newswire, which would be fairly kind of well ordered, and it would be formatted fairly well. You'd be able to read. But, every other, news agency out there, from Land's End to John O'Groats, would be filing stories into the other newswire from the UK, and it wouldn't be formatted. The writing, shall we say, from some of them would be of a questionable standard, and sometimes the story would be buried in the second to last paragraph. So you felt sometimes you had to read it all through. You'd write the times down when you last checked it, and then you'd pop off to lunch. Not that you'd have a lunch hour, but you'd pop off for even 15 minutes, and then you'd find yourself about 50 stories behind, the current time. So yeah, it was hugely pressured, and it all, it contributes to this thing that that I've been looking into, where you're kind of being bombarded by things from all angles. And this was in a pre kind of social media age when I did this, so it's even harder now to keep track of everything that's going on, because you have these agency wires, you have everything that's going on in social media, you have the rolling news coverage, so it's hard to know where to look, and it's coming from all angles. And part of a journalist's job actually is to listen. Social media listening now is part of your toolkit, and listening to wires and listening to news, but it becomes to the point where you're listening too much, and it feels like the Tower of Babel, where you're getting all these voices in different languages coming at you from all angles. There's an output job as a journalist where you have to take that input but then transform it, whether that's through written journalism, whether that's through video or any other format. And it doesn't feel there's enough time to actually to do that, to do the output, because the input, all the it's I describe it as kind of a tsunami, a wave of of noise is coming at you. And it's not just, as you said, as you intimated there, it's not just while you're sitting at your desktop. It's on your phone, which obviously, that follows you around everywhere. So there's, and it's let's just be clear here, it's not just something that's particular to journalism, although, what we're doing, we're in a breaking news mode, but it's people who work in business or in the city, and there's that desire to stay in touch and not feel like you're missing out as well. But that can be a problem. But the people that I spoke to as part of my service, quite interesting that they are unplugging. That they are, there was one person who I spoke to who just turns off their 4G. So if they are out of the office, they can't get emails. And I was like, oh, what? Are you sure you're right about that? Because you're not going to get any emails. And, there's that fear, that comes to you. Oh my God, like that fear, like when you go underground or you leave your phone at home, that you're going to be, you won't have access to information. And he's saying, I'm doing this for my sanity. So I think I didn't quite realize it, but I was this investigations. I need to explain what I was doing for the European Journalism Centre. I for 9 months, for a finite period, I investigated how journalists have been bombarded with information from all angles. And, this was just a kind of a hunch that I had. The reason why I did it was because a couple of people had spoken to me about it. And I thought, oh, right, okay, this feels like an issue. But actually somebody from a third-party data provider, someone who I'd come to know very well, suggested I should do this for the European Journalism Centre. And they were setting up a news impact network, which was a cohort of 16 journalism leaders from around Europe, where you could kind of share information and lessons and learnings and collaborate. And, we realised that journalism, the industry, is in a bit of a fix at the moment. And the idea that came from the burghers at the European Journalism Centre was that, together we can try and fix a few issues. So as I explained, I'd gone freelance and I was consulting. So a lot of my colleagues as part of this network were looking at particular problems within their own newsroom, which is more than fair enough. But because I was freelancing, I thought I'd look at a kind of a much wider issue rather than just an issue that would affect just one newsroom. And a bit like trying to achieve world peace, I just thought, well, why don't we try and look at this problem of overload, of journalists being overburdened? Just talk to people and listen to them, see if there was really an issue, and think about kind of next steps forward. So, yeah, I just started speaking. It was just like concentric circles. It was talking to people as part of my network. But then, the word spread and people started getting in touch with me and explaining what their issues were. When I started out in journalism, there wasn't that notion of having to write several stories a day. It was go out and just get a story, and if you get it done, that's fine. And that might appear quite quaint or quite an easy way of working, but you were encouraged to leave the office or get on the phone and speak to people. But now within a digital newsroom, if you don't have a certain amount of quota of stories you do each day, if you don't do a lot, then questions are kind of asked, and also now, you're measured. People can measure your impact, and depending on what that success measure is, it could be page views, uniques, or whatever, or dwell time. It feels like as a journalist, your success is kind of measured on how many eyeballs have gone on your story. And again, when I was starting, you just wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have a conversation with somebody who looked at circulation, but now you're talking to heads of audience development managers who may give you a kind of report on how impactful your journalism has been. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. I think a lot of the problems with journalism is that it was kind of pale, stale white men would kind of say, this is what's important, and I'm going to go and write about it. And it didn't reflect their communities. And I think looking into the impact of your journalism can serve an incredibly important role within the newsroom, because if you're writing stuff that nobody wants to read, well, maybe you need to have a think and reconsider it. But it should be as a guide rather than an overarching instruction that you've just got to get clicks and you've got to get hits. But of course, business models are under pressure to grow their audiences. So that is something that a modern day journalist has to deal with. I wanted to do a survey, and I did a survey of around about 10 questions, kind of quite broad questions around it, because again, the irony wasn't lost on me that you're getting an email asking you to take some time out to fill in a survey about how overwhelmed you are. And I did it on SurveyMonkey, and they said when you were doing the questions, you can see how long it's going to take. And I go, this will take about 6 to 7 minutes. So I could have, I had 100 questions, and actually that hadn't occurred to me, to be honest. But it's a very pertinent question about wanting to be seen. But I had to kind of balance it, with the fact that, I could ask 50 questions, but it would take you an hour to do. And, again, you're demanding their attention and time to kind of fill it in. So I kind of kept it 6 to 7 minutes. The need to be seen in terms of your profile, joining the conversation on Twitter, whether it's, at question time or PMQs, just to show, you're there, you're on top of things. That's another issue that you've got to deal with. But, when you might want to switch off, say on a Thursday evening, one day before Friday, no, question time is on now with Fiona Bruce. And I need to be seen to be getting involved. So, it is really hard to switch off. I think there's a job, not just for journalists, so to speak, on the shop floor to do, but also for managers to get that kind of 360 degree awareness of what's going on. On top of that, you have people right at the top of the organization who perhaps want to show that they're making an impact, who are pivoting towards digital, who are under pressure to come up with new ways to tell stories, and they're foisting on another thing onto journalists. And it might look, the thing that they introduce might be new, bright, shiny, new and groovy, but it might mean, and it might be very digital, and it may be worthwhile doing, but it's another thing that perhaps a journalist will have to do in their working day on top of all the other stuff, which might be looking at wires, which might be, listening to social media, and they want me to look at another platform. And that's why, as part of my conversation, I wanted to kind of gauge the attitudes from third-party data providers. It was probably something that, now that I did a first swing at it, I want to speak to kind of data providers and just say, well, look, do you realize what you're doing when you're creating all these products? And there's, I think a lot of journalists out there who are listening will just think, I've got to listen to this dashboard, I've got to have that dashboard up, I've got those notifications up. And, there are Slack integrations now where things can work together. But I think that there's two sets of folks that need to realize what's going on. The leaders right at the very top, who probably don't know what the journalists are doing in their working day and just have a realization of the pressures that they're under, but also third-party providers of information and data, of news. And there needs to be an awareness on their part too. Well, the editors are overwhelmed, and there's one person who's an editor who works at a news organisation, he was saying, I've got 100,000 unopened emails, which actually it's probably loads of people have done that. And there was actually an article, I think last week, I don't know, I think it was it's called Email Freedom, where you just accept that you're not going to open all your emails. It's, if you are ignored by an editor, please, it isn't a kind of a personal thing. They're overwhelmed and under pressure themselves. And I think a bit like, PRs would, I don't know if you or your audience members ever spoke to PRs and go, when is the best time for me to get in touch with a journalist. Perhaps freelance journalists should think about that as well. And it used to be that this is in an analog age when there used to be, a morning conference and an afternoon conference. And it's like, there's no point trying to get hold of a journalist just before morning conference because they're going to be under pressure, under stress. But if you have a knowledge of your editor, your commissioning editor's working day, and you know that there might be a pressure point for her or him at a certain point where either she or he has got to, either present a news list or do something for their bosses. And maybe that's when you are speaking to them, when you do get either FaceTime or downtime to them, just say, when is the best time to get hold of you in your busy day? And, I get a lot of emails from freelancers where it's the emails, the pictures are kind of, particularly when they're cold call emails, are scripted badly. They don't have it feels like they've copied and pasted, several of these emails are not really thought about the news organization that they're writing for. They don't have an awareness of who the audience, we would not take something like that. It's just, if you'd bothered to have a look at our site, we so wouldn't have done it. So it might be 5 or 6 news outlets where you can still keep the boilerplate email or pitch that you've got, but just tweak it to the news organization rather than it feels like a machine gun just firing up into the sky, not hitting anything. If something absolutely massive happens and then you get an email from saying, I've got this idea for a story, it's like, no, it's have an awareness. I was talking earlier about news editors and leaders having a 360 awareness. Freelance journalists should have a 360 awareness as well of what's going on. So if you're working for a breaking news outlet and something huge has happened, just say we vote to leave the European Union or not, say for instance, perhaps don't come up with the pitch on that day. But if you're looking around and just going, it looks like a slow news day here, well, that's your opportunity. That's when a commission editor or news editor is fishing around for something. And that's when, they might bite. So know the news organization that you're pitching at, but also know the rise and fall of the day, but also just have a look around. And if it's a slow news day, go for it. It's hard to get optimistic sometimes about it. Well, there's a community of people out there that care about journalism. When it feels like, our own institution is being questioned and threatened, by the leader of the free world, I think, that's something worth fighting for. I think we're so bad at explaining to people what we do. And how do you do that without coming across as kind of as arrogant or sententious, saying like, you really, democracy, you really need us. It's a tricky line to do, but I think we need to extol our success stories, how we hold people and power and institutions to account. And if you think of the democratic deficit now in local affairs, I think part of that is because the local news journalist, that person that would turn up to the council meetings, which again might not be a sexy job, but having somebody there holding councils and institutions to account is hugely important. And I've spoken to councillors, can say, I perform differently when I know a journalist is in the room. If I'm at a council meeting, I will act differently when a journalist is there because somebody is going to report what they say. So we need to explain, and we've got a bad rep, but because Fleet Street, you mention Fleet Street to the most people, and people will come up with a view, you're up to no good, you're going through bins, or it's phone hacking, or you come up with fake news. We need to counter that ourselves. And the problem is, because it's such an adversarial business and we're kind of up against each other, we've been used to kind of beating each other. So stories that we don't come together and just think about how do we explain ourselves. And very often, when you have somebody coming on to defend the media and, perhaps the tabloid media, they roll out, a fat, balding, middle-aged white bloke who's got a Cockney accent and who was the tabloid editor at whatever place and tries to defend it. And so we need to think of what the message is, but what kind of people actually deliver that message. And if we are to survive as an industry, we've got to grow our audiences. So we've got to appeal to more audiences, and we've got to reflect that. We've got to reflect, the modern society that we live in. So there's great journalism that is still being committed. And you look at, there's still great scoops that have been done, not just by the traditional Fleet Street legacy news brands, but by digital news organizations with investigations teams. There's a lot of accountability journalism that is being committed. And we need to explain that to people and just say, well, look, this costs money to do, but the world will be a poorer place if you're not reading about that. If people are just thinking, no, this isn't the career for me because I've just had enough, we're going to start losing people. We really need to think about this. And how we treat our journalists, and newsroom managers need to think about, just don't throw another tool or another platform at a journalist to kind of monitor during the day. Just have a think about, well-being and, conversations now. You look at the national conversation about mental health and wellness, all the subjects around that. I think there's a heightened awareness around that in any industry, but particularly in ours, when we are under a lot of pressure. We need to act on it rather than talk about it. They're being worn down, and it should be the best stage of your life as a journalist when you're rolling your sleeves up, you're learning your trade, you're having fun, you're not weighed down by other commitments. For the most part, when you're in your 20s, for the most of us, you might be single. You're just throwing all your energies into your job. But it feels when you speak to journalists, it just feels like a slog. And, a lot of, we were just talking right at the start about the glamour of it. That's disheartening, isn't it? When you see journalists who just, oh God, it's kind of, you're part of the rat race, and you shouldn't feel like that. Certainly in the first few years of your career. And it's, we call that churnalism, isn't it? In the digital newsroom, where you're just turning around stories and you're not going out because you're under pressure to hit a certain quota. It's depressing.
Wait, stop the music. We can't end this episode about burnout on the word depressing. And actually, it's not a fair representation of the really fun chat I had with John. Let me go back to the edit.
I sort of fell into journalism in a way because I guess it was like reading literature and writing was probably the least worst thing. I was out. I certainly wasn't a mathematician or a scientist or anything else, but I loved to read books, and I loved writing essays in English literature. And I had a really inspirational English teacher who actually just after 25 years I kind of met again, which was an amazing thing to do, just to tell him my career, so to speak, in journalism. I really owed it to him. He was just really good at inspiring me and getting into to reading and writing.
There we go. I found a more fun note to end on, didn't I? So thanks to John Crowley for joining me on the podcast and talking to me about all things burnout and telling me all about his career. And of course, thanks for the Mowlam story. All stories about her are great. Well, that's it for another episode of Freelance Pod. If you enjoyed what we talked about in this episode, please do get involved on social. You can find Freelance Pod on Instagram as @freelancepod, on Twitter as @freelance_pod_. There's a Facebook group called Freelance Pod, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. The URL is in the show notes. Don't forget that the success of this podcast relies on you, the listeners. If you do enjoy it, please do rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes. This means that other listeners will find out that this podcast exists and they'll come and join us too. That's it for now. Speak to you again soon. Goodbye.